For decades, Britain had one joke it never got tired of telling. Look at the Americans, look at the ice drowning their drinks. Look at the air conditioning running in houses that don't need it. Look at the burger bought without ever leaving the car. It wasn't a joke told once, it was told for 50 years, in newspapers, in sitcoms, in the raised eyebrow of a British host watching an American ask for more ice. Then, without a single headline announcing it, the joke started disappearing, quietly, item by item. The things Britain mocked began showing up in its own kitchens, its own homes, its own high streets, never admitted, never explained, just there. What you're about to see are 6 of those things. 6 habits Britain spent decades laughing at, and 6 moments where that laughter had nowhere left to go. Go back to 1955. An American tourist orders a Coca-Cola in a London pub and watches the barman drop in a single, reluctant cube, the kind that seems designed to melt before it does anything useful. The tourist asks for more. The barman looks at him the way you'd look at someone asking for extra salt on a wound. More ice? You'll ruin it. That exchange happened, in one form or another, for the next 50 years. It became a stock joke, in travel columns warning Brits abroad about watered-down American cocktails, in comedy sketches where the American character orders a soda and receives what looks like a glass of crushed glacier, in the way British hosts would quietly ration ice at dinner parties, convinced they were protecting their American guests from ruining a good whiskey. The accusation was always dressed up as a matter of taste. Real drinkers, the thinking went, wanted to taste what they'd paid for, not dilute a perfectly good scotch into flavorless water. American ice habits became shorthand for a broader verdict. Loud, excessive, unable to leave well enough alone. What nobody said out loud, because nobody quite realized it themselves, was that the real story wasn't taste, it was infrastructure. American households had been running electric refrigerators with built-in ice trays since the 1930s. By the post-war years, ice wasn't a luxury in the US, it was a utility as unremarkable as tap water. British households were living a different history entirely. Refrigerators arrived in British homes decades later than in America, and even once they did, they were small. Built for a country where people still shopped daily at the butcher, the greengrocer, the corner shop, and had no reason to store much of anything, let alone frozen water. A British pub kept one ice bucket behind the bar, because that was all the tiny freezer compartment in the back room could produce between deliveries. The joke about Americans ruining their drinks was never really about flavor. It was Britain quietly turning a shortage into a personality trait. For decades, that arrangement held. Ice remained something Britain rationed and America wasted, and the joke kept working precisely because the infrastructure gap never closed. Then commercial refrigeration got radically cheaper. Supply chains got colder, faster, more reliable. Supermarkets stopped being weekly errands and started being one-stop operations with freezer aisles running the length of the store. And somewhere in the middle of all that, nobody can point to the year, bagged ice stopped being a summer novelty item in the UK and became something supermarkets stocked 12 months a year right next to the frozen peas. Walk into a British pub today and the bartender doesn't rescue you from ice. Cafe menus feature iced coffee as a permanent fixture, not a seasonal gimmick imported for the 2 hot weeks of an English summer. It's now one of the fastest growing drink categories in British cafe chains, ordered as readily in April as in August. Cocktail bars in London measure their ice programs the way American bars do, with dedicated machines producing clear, dense cubes built for slow melting, the exact opposite of the reluctant chips served in 1955. The commercial ice machine, once a purely American fixture behind every diner counter, is now standard equipment in British kitchens that would once have scoffed at the idea of needing one. Nobody in Britain ever stood up and said the joke was wrong. There was no headline, no cultural reckoning, no moment where anyone admitted that the tourist asking for more ice in 1955 wasn't ruining anything. He just had access to something Britain didn't yet have. The apology never came. The ice just kept arriving, cube by cube, machine by machine, until one day it was simply how everyone in Britain drank. And the joke, quietly, had nothing left to stand on.
I have found out why America is so great. And it is one thing and one thing only. L'air conditioning. It is the greatest thing I have ever experienced. It is hotter than Satan's butt crack out here. But what makes it bearable is the air conditioning. I believe you need to add a verse to your national anthem that talks about air conditioning. Americans are only scared of one thing, and that is being hot. But I love it. I love it. Is it something you have against being hot? Because the air conditioning, the ice in everything.
For most of the 20th century, air conditioning was one of the easiest things for Britain to laugh at because it seemed to answer a problem Britain didn't believe it had. American tourists would step off a plane in July, take one look at a British house with its windows cracked open and a single fan rotating in the corner, and ask, half joking, half horrified, "How do you survive?" The British answer was always some version of the same thing. A shrug, a joke about toughening up, a reminder that this was a temperate island, not Arizona. Air conditioning wasn't just unnecessary here, it was treated as evidence of something soft in the American character, a country too uncomfortable with its own weather to simply open a window. American sitcoms didn't help the case. Every US household on screen had a hum of central cooling running in the background. Window units dripping onto suburban lawns, characters complaining about bills that seem to exist purely to keep a house artificially cold. British audiences watched this and felt, if anything, a kind of smug relief. Why would anyone need to refrigerate their living room? The joke wasn't really about temperature, it was about restraint. The idea that Americans reached for a machine to solve what the British simply endured. And for a long time, the endurance made sense because the maths worked in Britain's favor. Average summer temperatures rarely climbed high enough to make cooling feel essential. Houses were built, over centuries, to hold heat in, not push it out, because the dominant threat was always the cold, damp winter, not the occasional warm week in July. Installing anything resembling American-style air conditioning in a British home would have meant fighting the entire architecture of the building. Solid walls, small windows, insulation designed to trap warmth rather than release it. The absence of AC wasn't a lifestyle choice. It was simply never engineered for. That's the part the joke never accounted for, because the climate underneath it was quietly changing. Heat waves that used to arrive once a decade started arriving most summers. The UK's hottest day on record hit 40 degrees Celsius in July 2022, a temperature that would have been unthinkable in the era when air conditioning was still a punchline. Government housing surveys have since found that roughly 3 million homes in England now get reported as uncomfortably hot and effectively impossible to cool down using traditional methods. Fans, open windows, drawn curtains. The exact toolkit Britain once held up as proof of its own resilience. The response has been unmistakable, even if nobody in Britain has framed it as a reversal. The number of UK homes with some form of air conditioning has roughly doubled in just the past few years, climbing toward an estimated 4 million households. During recent summer heat waves, retailers like Currys have reported air conditioning sales spiking by over 300% in a single week, alongside fan sales climbing even higher, a sign not of casual interest, but of genuine last-minute urgency. Portable units now sell out during heat spikes, the way umbrellas sell out during a downpour. Industry forecasts expect the UK air conditioning market to keep growing for the next decade, and government policy has quietly started supporting air-to-air heat pumps that provide cooling as a built-in feature, not an embarrassing add-on. None of this arrived with an admission. Nobody in Britain issued a statement saying the Americans had been right to cool their homes all along. There was no retraction of the old jokes about softness or excess. Instead, the units simply started appearing. First in a few homes during the worst heat waves, then in more, then advertised in shop windows the way winter coats once were. The country that spent decades treating air conditioning as an American indulgence is now buying it in the middle of the night during a heat wave, quietly, one unit at a time, with the joke nowhere in sight. There was a specific kind of appliance that British homeowners for decades treated as a punchline in metal and plastic: the American fridge. Not just any refrigerator, the towering side-by-side kind, wide enough to fit a small child inside, with a water dispenser built into the door and an automatic ice maker humming away like it had somewhere important to be. British sitcoms and lifestyle columns love to mock it as the ultimate symbol of American excess. A machine built not for a kitchen, but for a warehouse, purchased by people who apparently needed to stockpile a month's worth of food at a time, as if a corner shop might vanish overnight. The mockery had a specific edge to it because it wasn't just about size, it was about what the size implied. British kitchens were built around a different rhythm of living entirely. A trip to the butcher for meat, the greengrocer for vegetables, the corner shop for whatever was forgotten, often daily, sometimes twice a day. A fridge in that world only ever needed to hold a few days of food. Milk, butter, leftovers, maybe a joint of meat for Sunday. Anything bigger wasn't just unnecessary. It looked faintly suspicious, like evidence of a household that didn't trust the shops to still be open tomorrow. The American fridge, with its ice dispenser and cavernous shelving, became shorthand for a country that hoarded instead of shopped, that substituted machinery for the simple, civilized act of walking to the shops. What that joke never accounted for was how completely the shopping itself was about to change. Through the latter half of the 20th century, British retail quietly restructured itself around the supermarket. First small chains, then vast out-of-town superstores with car parks the size of football pitches. The daily trip to 3 or 4 separate small shops gradually collapsed into a single weekly big shop, done once, often by car, stocked up for 7 days at a time rather than one. It wasn't a cultural shift so much as a logistical one. Supermarkets offered lower prices through volume, longer opening hours, and the convenience of buying everything under one roof. But a weekly shop for a family of 4 doesn't fit in a fridge built for daily top-ups. The old British kitchen, sized for a world of small daily errands, was suddenly being asked to store a week's worth of groceries in a space designed for 3 days. The result has been a quiet transformation of the British kitchen itself. American-style fridge freezers, the large capacity, side-by-side or French door models, complete with the water and ice dispensers that were once mocked as absurd, are now among the fastest growing categories in UK appliance sales, particularly as more homes are renovated or extended with larger open-plan kitchens built to accommodate them. Major British retailers that once stocked these models as a niche import for expats now carry them as standard lines, marketed not as an American novelty, but simply as what a modern family kitchen needs. Kitchen fitters report that fridge integration space has grown steadily in new build specifications over the past 2 decades, chasing a demand that didn't exist when the joke was first being told. Nobody in Britain ever framed this as catching up to America. There was no retraction of the old, "why do you need a fridge that big" jokes. No cultural acknowledgement that the mockery had been aimed at a machine built for a shopping pattern Britain simply hadn't adopted yet. The fridges just got bigger, kitchen by kitchen, renovation by renovation, until the towering American model, ice dispenser and all, stopped looking like an oddity and started looking like something every growing family was quietly saving up for. When McDonald's opened its first drive-thru window in Britain in the 1980s, the reaction wasn't curiosity, it was ridicule. Newspaper columnists wrote about it the way you'd write about a strange new import nobody had asked for, a symbol of a culture so attached to its cars, so unwilling to walk 20 feet, that it had engineered a way to buy a burger without ever opening a car door. British sitcoms took the same shot from a different angle, painting the drive-thru as proof of American laziness dressed up as innovation. The logical endpoint of a country that, as the joke went, would drive to the end of its own driveway if it could. There was a particular kind of British pride wrapped up in that mockery. Britain had the pub, the chip shop, the market stall, places you walked to, stood at, talked to someone across a counter. The high street was a social institution as much as a commercial one, built on foot traffic and small shop fronts packed close together in town centers that had existed for centuries before the car did. A restaurant you never had to leave your car for wasn't just impersonal. It felt like it was skipping a step in the transaction that Britain considered essential. The walk-in, the conversation, the sense of a place, rather than a transaction point on a road. What that joke didn't account for was how much the British landscape itself was about to be redrawn around the car. Out-of-town retail parks, ring roads, and suburban housing developments expanded steadily from the 1980s onward, pulling shopping and dining away from dense town centers and out toward locations only really reachable by driving. As commuting distances grew and town center parking got scarcer and more expensive, the entire logic of just walk in started to break down for a large share of everyday errands. The drive-thru wasn't really an American cultural import forcing its way into British life. It was an American solution to a spatial problem Britain was quietly starting to have for the first time. The numbers reflect exactly how far that shift has gone. Drive-thru locations have become one of the fastest expanding formats for major fast food and coffee chains across the UK over the past 2 decades, with new sites opening specifically along ring roads, retail parks, and motorway service areas. The exact geography the format was originally mocked for depending on what was once treated as a novelty attached to a handful of American branded restaurants near motorways is now a standard feature planned into new retail developments from the outset, treated by property developers as essential infrastructure rather than an afterthought. No one in Britain ever stood up and admitted that the joke about laziness had actually been a joke about geography, that the country wasn't becoming lazier, it was becoming more car-dependent, one ring road and retail park at a time, in a pattern American suburbs had been through decades earlier. There was no cultural reckoning, no headline conceding the point. The drive-through lanes simply kept appearing, longer and busier every year, until sitting in a queue of cars waiting to order without ever stepping outside stopped looking like an American oddity and started looking like a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. A porch light switches off on October 31st deliberately in a British suburb sometime in the mid-1990s. It's not an oversight. It's a small, understood signal. This house isn't participating. Down the street, a newspaper someone left on the kitchen table carries an opinion column calling trick-or-treating begging with menaces, a phrase that would run, in one form or another, in British papers for the next 2 decades. That was the tone Halloween got in Britain for most of its early life there. Not curiosity, but irritation. Parents complained about children turning up uninvited at strangers' doors demanding sweets. Commentators dismissed the whole thing as tacky, a commercial holiday manufactured by American candy companies with no local roots to justify it. Bonfire Night, arriving just days later on November 5th, got held up as the real autumn tradition, something with actual British history behind it. Unlike this borrowed plastic pumpkin import that seemed to exist purely to sell costumes nobody had asked for. Underneath the irritation was a specific accusation that Halloween wasn't a holiday anyone genuinely wanted, but one that had been manufactured into existence by retailers looking for something to sell in the quiet stretch between back to school and Christmas. And that accusation happened to be true. It just wasn't an argument against Halloween. It was a description of exactly why British retailers would eventually want it too. Supermarkets and confectionery companies discovered what their American counterparts had figured out decades earlier. An empty slot in the retail calendar is worth filling, whether or not the holiday has any local history behind it. It didn't require anyone in Britain to genuinely love Halloween. It only required shelf space, seasonal packaging, and a reason to get shoppers through the door in an otherwise slow month. The scale of what followed is hard to overstate. UK Halloween spending has roughly quadrupled since 2013, with 2025 projections placing it somewhere between £537 million and £779 million, depending on the measure used. A genuinely enormous sum for a holiday British newspapers were still calling a passing fad within living memory. Supermarket chains now run dedicated Halloween aisles weeks in advance, competing directly with Christmas displays for shelf space. Nearly half of UK shoppers now say they actively participate in some form, and spending skews heaviest among younger adults. The generation that grew up with Halloween already normalized, never having lived through the era when it needed defending. No columnist ever printed a retraction. No one admitted the old complaints had been aimed at a holiday that simply hadn't found its footing yet. The porch lights just started coming back on, one October at a time, until a pumpkin in the front window stopped being a statement about where a family's loyalties lay, and became something closer to background noise. Expected, unremarkable. And for the supermarket stocking the aisle, extremely profitable. In the early 1970s, a British bank clerk hands a customer a small rectangle of plastic and explains, patiently, that this is how Barclaycard works now. You can buy something today and pay for it later, a little at a time with interest. The customer's reaction, more often than not, is suspicion, not enthusiasm, suspicion. Because to a generation raised on cash in an envelope, on paying the milkman weekly, on the idea that if you couldn't afford something outright, you simply didn't buy it, this looked less like convenience and more like a trap dressed up as modern banking. That suspicion had a specific target: America. British commentators had spent years watching American consumer culture from a distance and concluding that the whole country was living on borrowed money it didn't have. A nation of installment plans, revolving credit, and department store cards, buying refrigerators and cars on payments stretched out for years. The word used most often wasn't convenient. It was reckless. British financial columns through the 1960s and 70s warned readers not to follow the American habit of living beyond one's means, framing consumer credit as a kind of moral failing wrapped in a shiny plastic card, proof that Americans had traded thrift and self-restraint for instant gratification. Owning something you hadn't fully paid for yet wasn't aspirational in Britain. It was faintly embarrassing. What that judgment didn't account for was how thoroughly the entire architecture of everyday spending was about to change. Not because British attitudes shifted first, but because the financial infrastructure underneath consumer life eventually had to. As the post-war cash economy gave way to a world of standing orders, direct debits, and eventually digital transactions, the machinery that made credit cards work in America, centralized credit bureaus, standardized interest calculations, retailer payment networks, got built out in Britain too, item by item, decade by decade. Once that infrastructure existed, the appeal of paying over time stopped being a foreign eccentricity and started being simply how a modern financial system functioned. The judgment about American recklessness hadn't been wrong about the risk. It had just assumed the alternative, cash-only thrift, could survive contact with a retail economy that was rapidly outgrowing it. The numbers on the other side of that shift are hard to argue with. The vast majority of UK adults now carry at least one credit card, and consumer credit, cards, personal loans, and increasingly buy now, pay later services has become as embedded in British spending habits as it ever was in American ones. That last part is its own quiet irony. Buy now, pay later platforms, marketed to a generation that grew up hearing their grandparents warn against exactly this kind of borrowing, have exploded in the UK over the past several years, letting shoppers split the cost of a pair of shoes or a night out into 4 interest-free payments with a few taps on a phone. It is, structurally, the same installment logic that British commentators once treated as evidence of American excess, just faster, more automated, and stripped of the plastic card altogether. Nobody in British banking or government ever stood up and said the old warnings about American-style credit had been wrong. There was no retraction of the columns calling installment buying reckless, no acknowledgement that the living beyond your means framing had quietly become the default way an entire country manages its money. The shift never got announced. It just accumulated: one Barclaycard in 1966, one direct debit in the 1980s, one contactless tap in the 2010s, one buy now pay later checkout button in 2022, until the idea of paying for something before you'd actually paid for it stopped being a peculiarly American habit and became simply how Britain shops. The bank clerk from the 1970s, if he were still working today, wouldn't need to explain anything. He'd just hand over the card. Six things, 6 decades of jokes: ice, air conditioning, an oversized fridge, a drive-through window, a pumpkin on a porch, a piece of plastic that lets you pay for something before you've actually paid for it. None of them arrived in Britain with an apology. None of them arrived with an admission. They just arrived, quietly, one appliance, one storefront, one card swipe at a time, until the thing that used to get mocked simply became the thing that got used. That's the pattern worth noticing here. It was never really about ice or fridges or pumpkins. It was about a country insisting, for decades, that its way of doing things was the proper way, only to discover that infrastructure, climate, and convenience don't particularly care what gets called proper. They just move toward whatever works. And when it moves, nobody sends out a press release. The porch light just comes back on. So the next time someone tells you a habit is uniquely American, too loud, too excessive, too much, it might be worth remembering. That's usually not the end of the story. It's just the part right before everyone else quietly catches up.